Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where we are going to be talking today about DNFing. DNFing, which, if you don't know book lingo, means did not finish. Something that we talk about quite a bit on BookTube, books that we have DNF'd. And it's something that, is normal. Sometimes a book just doesn't work for you, you read a little bit of it, sometimes you read a lot of it, and you just can't take anymore, and you have to move on. So it's a normal thing, but there are extremes, among readers. Some readers DNF everything almost. They end up DNFing more than they read, which I imagine would be a real problem. Other readers never DNF anything. They never DNF anything. And wouldn't you know it, I fall into one of those extremes. Shocking, I know, but I never DNF anything, man. I can't do it. I've tried, and I can't DNF books. Now, this is an issue. This is an issue. I'm not sure why this is. I'm not sure why I am the way I am and cannot bring myself to DNF books. Part of it is, I think, that if I were to DNF a book, it would be like I failed somehow, which is silly. And logically, I know that this is silly. But yeah, I think part of me is like, I won't let this book beat me. I will read this whole book. And part of it is that I don't think I could really give a reasonable assessment or opinion on a book unless I've read the whole thing. I want to have the whole experience of the book from beginning to end so I could really make up my mind about it. I mean, there are reasons, but to never DNF at all, ever, it could lead you into, some problems. DNFing is a normal thing. It's a normal thing. And to decide when you should DNF a book, that's kind of up to you. I mean, well, it is up to you. It's not kind of up to you. It is up to you. As a reader, that's your decision when you want to just cut your losses and leave a book behind and move on to something that you might like a lot better. Personally, I do feel like, just from watching other booktubers and people talking about books, I do feel like people tend to give up on books too soon. I do feel like people tend to bail on books early, and that maybe if they just stuck it out a little bit longer, maybe it would work out for them. Maybe, but it doesn't matter what I think. This is just my thinking, but it doesn't matter what I think. You as a reader, it matters what you think. And it matters why you're reading the book too. If you're reading a book, for school or a class, you can't bail on it really. But if it's just for entertainment, if it's just because you want to read it, just, in your leisure time, really, it's okay to bail at any time. It's up to you. Anytime you want to DNF a book. But for me, I can't do it. But like I said, this has led me to read and spend time reading perhaps some books that I shouldn't have spent my time reading. And it's not always because books are bad. For example, I'm going to give a book I've talked about before, The Sound and the Fury. This is a book which is not a bad book. I didn't enjoy this book at all. I actually, this is the last book I actually made an attempt to DNF. I tried to stop reading this book. I set this book down, and yet I remember when I stopped reading it, I'm like, I can't take this book. This book is confusing, it's bewildering, it makes no sense. A book that's a novel, it shouldn't be this difficult. And Faulkner, The Sound of the Fury by William Faulkner, he was doing this deliberately, of course. This was deliberately difficult. And so I remember I set the book down because I didn't know what the hell was going on in the book. And I walked away from it. It was such a frustrating experience. I was going to pick up something else, but I didn't. And you know, my brain just started catching on fire or something. I had to keep reading it. I knew I had to go back and finish the book. And once I started reading it a little bit more, I kind of caught on, oh, okay, I figured out what's going on in this story. There are multiple timelines and, you know, different viewpoints and all this. Okay, I get it. I understand where this is, what's going on. And that was like halfway through the book before I figured out what the hell was going on. I'm no genius. So I had to go back to the beginning. I actually reread everything that I had already read, but with the new understanding I had of what I was reading. So then I ended up reading the whole of The Sound and the Fury and did not enjoy a second of it. And since finishing it, I haven't really decided whether I should have DNF'd it or not. Part of me feels like since it was not a pleasant reading experience, maybe I should have DNF'd it, you know, if I were normal. At the same time, I do recognize the genius of this work. I'm not saying it's a bad book at all. It's, you know, many consider this a masterpiece of literature, and there are people who feel that this is their favorite book. It's hard to believe, but there are people who think that this is their favorite book. So I'm not going to go out on a limb and say this book was bad just because I didn't like it and because I had a bad experience with it, because it's not. It's not a bad book. It's just a book that I hated reading. I did not like it at all. So should I have DNF'd it? There are people that would say, yeah, you should have bailed on this early. I haven't made up my own mind about it, though. I'm not sure. You know, there are other books. Another book comes to mind. This is not anywhere close to being The Sound of the Fury. This is the Tarnsman of Gore, or Tarnsman of Gore by John Norman. This is a kind of sword and planet science fiction fantasy series, the Gore series. And this is the first book in the series by John Norman. Now, this series famously started off as one thing and kind of turned into something else. It started off as kind of an Edgar Rice Burroughs Barsoom Martian series pastiche type of thing. Very much influenced by Edgar Rice Burroughs Martian stories. A little bit too much, maybe. And then the series just turns into this whole weird thing about John Norman's weird fetish where he's writing about a planet where women are slaves and they want to be slaves, you know, because that's their proper place. It's this whole weird thing. And John Norman, like, never has stopped writing these. I think the series might still be going on. It just went on forever and has continued to go on forever. Even it lost its publisher. I think it's being self-published now. And it just went on this weird track, the Gore series. I read the first book. I remember reading it, and it was just, it was okay. It wasn't great. It was just, But even as I was reading it, I had heard where this series was going, you know. I knew about John Norman and his thing. Maybe it was curiosity because I had heard that the first few books in the series were not quite what they became. But looking back, I feel like, you know what, I didn't need to finish that book because I knew reading it that I wasn't going to continue the series, you know. I certainly wasn't going to finish the series. And it wasn't that good. It was too derivative without being fun. It's okay to be derivative as long as you're fun and you have, you know, entertainment value. There are a lot of books that are, you know, rip-offs of A Princess of Mars, for example, that are fun, you know. Some of the Lynn Carter stuff was fun. This wasn't. And the action wasn't good. I remember feeling like the action wasn't particularly well written. Some of it was actually clumsy. I mean, it just didn't, it wasn't working for me. So should I have DNF'd it? You know, probably. I didn't, you know. And it wasn't a great loss because it wasn't a giant book or anything like that. Unlike, let's say, Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard, which was just plain mediocre. And it was gigantic. This is a gigantic, mediocre science fiction novel. And it's never anything other than mediocre. And it's like 9 gazillion pages. This book is huge. So it's an investment of time for something that's really kind of crap, you know? So, of course I read the whole thing, and it was a waste of my time reading this whole thing because, like I said, it's a gigantic, mediocre science fiction book. If it were like a couple hundred pages, you know, maybe I wouldn't even think about it too much. But this thing is a massive book, and it's a massive mediocre book. I should have DNF'd this book. You know, if I were, you know, in my right mind, I would have DNF'd this book. Certainly. Another book that's too large that comes to mind is Justine by the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade. You know, the world famous pervert. The Marquis de Sade. Who wrote, you know, kind of perverted books and got in a lot of trouble for it. Now, this book, it was pervy, but it was more than anything boring. This was just tediously dull. One of the most boring things I've ever written, that I've ever read. Thank goodness I didn't write it. This is one of the most tedious things I've ever read. Just incredibly boring. So I should have just walked away from this early, right? There was no reason I should have suffered through this. The Marquis de Sade loves to torture folks in his books, and he tortured me in reading this. And so I feel like, you know, he should have gone to prison for writing this, just because it was so bad. And it was bad. It was a legitimately bad book. So there's that. And speaking of legitimately bad books, there's Tock. There's Tock by Dean Koontz. Another book. Now, this book wasn't huge. It was one of his shorter books. I also think it was one of Dean Koontz's worst books, which is really saying something. This book was terrible, and I recognized it as being terrible right away. When a book is terrible, and you see that it's terrible, and it's going to stay terrible, walk away, man. Just walk away. I should have walked away from Tock. The funny thing about Dean Koontz is that he can write entertaining books, at least he could at one time in his career. And I've enjoyed some of his books, but man, when he writes a stinky book, it's stinky, man. And this was stinky. I tell you, this could be one of the worst books I've ever read. It's not, though, because I read Maximum Ride by James Patterson. James Patterson, an author so bad he doesn't even write his own books anymore. And this book, Maximum Ride, I read it when it first came out. I believe I bought it at an airport. I'm almost certain I bought it at an airport when it was new, and I was like, you know, that looks like it might be entertaining on a plane and in a hotel room. Why not? This was terrible, absolutely terrible. And James Patterson is terrible. And this book is, how does James Patterson how did he ever make any money? Who thinks this book is good? This book is like the first book out of a series. Imagine how wretched the other ones are, because this one was just bad in every way. I should have bailed on this after like 20 pages, if that. Because I saw which way it was going, man. I saw how this was going, and I should have not finished it, but I couldn't help. I couldn't stop myself from finishing this terrible, terrible, terrible book. So listen, don't be like me. Don't be like me. If you can help it, and you're reading a book, first of all, if you start reading a book by James Patterson, just stop. Just stop reading the book, because it's going to suck. But if you're reading a book and it's legitimately bad, definitely DNF it. Now, there's some books you might want to stick with for other reasons, even though it's not a great time for you. But definitely, if the book is stinky and terrible, don't be like me. bail on the book. Bail on it. DNF it. Otherwise, if it doesn't look like it's legitimately awful, then make up your own mind later on. You know, give it a little bit more time maybe. If it's just not working for you, and like I said, this could be a good book. It could be a well-written book, and it just doesn't work for you. Go ahead and bail on it, you know. But it's up to you. Okay, that's all I have to say about it. I will catch you next time.